So we finished up C.S. Lewis last week, kind of late because of my illness, and my plan was to dive into Paul's epistle to the Romans, and then I realized we only have like 5 or 6 forums left, and to try and get through Romans in 5 or 6 45-minute, 30-minute sessions is insane. So I'm taking requests. I did notice in the media this past week a lot of confusion about the theology of just war. So I thought I'd give you like a little course on just war theology. This is a terrifying thing to do in Washington, D.C., and even more so at St. Albans, because we have 2 of the chief lights from political science from Georgetown and GW here. We have a world disarmament expert. We have people who know much more about the actual sort of political theory of just war than I do. So I'm just going to stick to my theological lane, and the experts should chime in as they like. So my first question, so we have, of course, Guernica here. It's Picasso's depiction of the absolute horrors of war. And I think it should be said that, like, there are no wars that are not horrific, right? I mean, I think maybe there's some scenario in which 2 knights are jousting and they both sign up for it, or some condottieri who are all well paid and sort of enjoy fighting or are doing it for the love of being mercenaries. But for the most part, war is a really, really awful thing. So kind of the first question is like, is just war an oxymoron? Like, do we want to say all wars are inherently unjust, all wars are bad, full stop? Now that's a pretty defensible position, and in a sense, that is in a nutshell the Christian position on war. There's no good war, all war is bad. The thing is, so if war involves life-taking humans, it can never be just in an absolute sense. But it can be just in a relative sense. So even though we want to say all war involves suffering, all war involves destruction, all war involves horrible things, we do draw some distinctions. So on the one hand, you have like an army fighting in defense of their nation or of an ally. So here you have Finland in 1939. Versus an army that fights for plunder or to extend the boundaries of an empire. So this is Caesar in his conquest of Gaul, as depicted by a 19th century Russian. So draw no connection. Even though we want to say all war is bad, there's no good war, full stop. Any war is a bad war. We do want to say, this is not the same thing as that. This is more respectable than that. In this case, you have a group of people who are fighting to defend their freedom or their agency or their rights. In this case, you have someone just wants more living space or more wealth or more slaves or whatever it is. And there's a difference there. So, I mean, in a relative sense, this is more just than that from a theological perspective. And we'll get into the actual theology in a second. We also want to say there are differences in modes of waging war. So the way you fight a war matters. So you might have an army that strikes only legitimate military targets and renders the same medical aid to enemy combatants as it renders to his own soldiers. That's one way of fighting a war. So when I teach in a course at GW in which high-ranking military officials who run military hospitals all over the world, from the United States Army and Navy, Air Force, and then the Canadian military. They sort of come from continuing ed, and we talk about ethics. And they talk a lot, and we'll have sort of half of the class is like a sort of history of ethics, and half is a symposium. And when we get into the issues they face, a lot of them are these, what they call blue-on-green situations, in which you have 5 U.S. military personnel in a hospital, you have 5 enemy combatants, and you have enough for 5 blood transfusions, and how you make that decision. And this doesn't always happen, but United States policy is you treat the 5 people who are the most hurt. It doesn't matter if they were just shooting at you, you look and see who has the least chance of living without the transfusion, who has the best chance of living with the transfusion, and that's the person who gets the transfusion. So that's a very different way of waging a war than an army that actively kills civilians destroys civilian infrastructure, kills wounded and surrendering enemies. Again, Rome is the worst. This is the destruction of Carthage, where they ostensibly sowed the soil with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again, which is probably an 18th century myth. But like that is the way that Rome waged war. They just destroyed everything. You could think of like the Third Reich, and I think it's in, 40 or something, 39, this command is issued that all captives should be killed. I think it's called the Commando Order, which Rommel famously burned. But it's a very different way of waging war than the UN, than the United States at our best, than lots of other countries. So on the one hand, all war is bad, no war is just absolutely. On the other hand, just war really matters, right? Like if we want to say, it's all bad, why even talk about justice in war? Just do your thing, armies. That's not the world we want to live in, presumably. We actually do want armies that go to war because they have a just cause, and we want armies that in war act with some justice. Does that make sense? Is that a fair thing to say? So where do we get all this stuff? So there's a guy who I just heard some disturbing news about from one of our experts, but there's a guy whose book I really like, Just and Unjust Wars, Michael Walzer, worth a read, not a definitive guide, but an interesting book. War is always judged twice. First with reference to the reasons states have for fighting, secondly with reference to the means they adopt. The first kind of judgment is adjectival in character. We say that a particular war is just or unjust. The second is adverbial. We say that the war being fought justly or unjustly. So, we have these kind of norms that govern things like they inform UN charters and all sorts of things. Where do they come from? So, in the Christian tradition, you have this evolution of just war theory. Before Christianity, certainly there are examples of military policy in South Asia that are really concerned with justice. You have Cicero that makes some pronouncements about justice in war. I can't comment on the results of the South Asian policies. They were probably followed to the letter and in a very good way. Cicero's advice to the Roman Empire seemed to have no effect whatsoever, you know? His ideas about honorability in war seem to have not impacted Roman policy at all. So the first thinkers that we have kind of talking about this from a Christian perspective are Ambrose of Milan. And Ambrose is the great bishop of Milan. Before being a bishop, he was a provincial governor, so he was a high-ranking Roman official. He's a great rhetorician, a great philosopher. And in some of his texts, he kind of hints at what a just war would look like. He has a student, this guy who starts coming to his church as a Platonist pagan because he wants to meet ladies. And he's like sitting around, looking in the pew. He's like, maybe she could be eligible. Maybe I could just talk to her. He gets captured by Ambrose's rhetoric, starts listening more and more, is blown away by his skill at speaking, starts listening to the message, and eventually he's standing in this garden, and he hears this child's voice singing back and forth, take up and read, take up and read. So he takes up his Bible and starts reading, and he's like, whoa, this is some good stuff. His name is Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine also writes about kind of what justice in war looks like, what good reasons for going to war are, what a good fight looks like. The tricky thing about Ambrose and Augustine, and actually all the theologians writing about just war, is they're not trying to create a sort of political program. So they're not talking about a secular ethics. Everything they're doing is in the context of the Nicene Creed and Hebrews and just like the whole Christian tradition. So rather than saying, here is what every state should do, this is just like a kind of ethical policy paper, the theologians are all saying, how do you be a Christian in the context of war? Which is a very different question. So if you pull out quotes from Augustine, you're like, that's a kind of oblique way of getting to this point that we shouldn't kill civilians, All you're talking about is like all this Old Testament stuff. Can't you just cut to the chase? But for him, the chase is the Old Testament stuff. So it's kind of hard in these early texts to tease out this sort of like strict sort of ethics of war. Thomas Aquinas is the great systematizer of Western Christianity. So if you read the Summa, it takes a very long time because it's really long. B, it's dense, not because he is writing in an intentionally dense way. He's just trying to create these almost geometric proofs for everything he talks about, and think through all the sides, and think through with a lot of clarity. So it's Thomas that kind of takes this departure from just situating everything in the context of the Christian story and starts kind of pulling out these principles as principles in and of themselves. So there's actually an early copy of the Summa, which is kind of cool. He asks whether it's always sinful to wage war. It would seem that it's always sinful to wage war, because punishment is not inflicted except for sin. Now those who wage war are threatened by our Lord with the punishment, according to Matthew, all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Therefore all wars are unlawful. He has another objection. Further, nothing except sin is contrary to the act of virtue. But war is contrary to peace. Therefore war is always a sin. So these are kind of like the questions he's dealing with in his wrestling with war and just war. So I answer that in order for war to be just, three things are necessary. First, the authority of the sovereign, by whose command the war is to be waged. For it is not the business of a private individual to declare war, because he can seek for redress of his rights from the tribunal of his superior. So first of all, if you're just like, Larry, I think I'm going to go to war with Tanzania tomorrow, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you don't have the right to go to war. And if you, as a sovereign, haven't been given the sort of power by your people to declare a war, then you also are unable to declare war. Moreover, it's not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, which has to be done in wartime. So you can't muster a society, you can't muster an army. And as the care of the commonweal is committed to those who are in authority, it is their business to watch over the commonweal of the city, kingdom, or province subject to them. And just as it is lawful for them to have recourse to the sword in defending that commonweal against internal disturbances, so too it is their business to have recourse to the sword of war in defending the commonweal against external enemies. Hence it is said to those who are in authority, rescue the poor and deliver the needy out of the hand of the sinner. So Thomas is really situating like the power to actually go to war in a legitimate way in terms of the defense of the commonweal of society. Something's threatening like X country's freedom or their life or whatever, that's a reasonable cause to protect the commonweal of society. If I were to say, I, king, whatever, I'm going to go to war with Scotland so that I can get some Scottish wool and make some nice sweaters and, I like Harris Tweed or whatever, not a legitimate reason. Secondly, a just cause is required. Namely, that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. So, this is a little map of German-occupied Europe, September 1943. I don't think there are a lot of just causes that Germany had to attack the vast majority of the swath of territory, and this is why they had to sort of manufacture causes, like saying there's this Polish radio station that broadcast in German, and they've been taken over by a Polish military, and they've killed a bunch of people, and now they're broadcasting these anti-German broadcasts in Polish. Except it was actually Wehrmacht soldiers dressed up in Polish uniforms who were doing an anti-German broadcast in Polish. So there wasn't really a cause except for just gain, living space, whatever. As Augustine says, a just war is wont to be described as one that avenges wrongs, when a nation or state has to be punished, for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects or restore what was seized unjustly. Thirdly, it's necessary that the belligerent should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Hence, Augustine says, true religion looks upon as peaceful those wars that are waged not for motives of aggrandizement or cruelty, but with the object of securing peace, punishing evildoers, and of uplifting the good. For it may happen that war is declared by legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through a wicked intention. Hence Augustine says, the passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an unpacific and relentless spirit, the fever of revolt, the lust of power, and such like things, all these are rightly condemned in war. So you have the people of Paris welcoming Americans as liberators. Again, just at our best. This was sort of seen as us fulfilling these criteria. So, on the one hand, you have Ambrose, Augustine, lots of other theologians kind of being synthesized in Thomas. Here's what it looks like for a Christian to be in war. Here's what you want to ask yourself as a Christian before engaging in war. Does this mean that you produce a perfectly just conflict? Absolutely not. But it's sort of better than a war of greed, of rapine, of massacre, and so forth. The next thoughts about Thomas before we jump into a guy who's a little bit more specific about this stuff. He's worth reading. It's super interesting. Francisco de Victoria is a Dominican friar in Salamanca, and he is really interested in some of his work in what Spain is doing in the New World. And he's pretty horrified by what he sees. He's taking this synthesis that comes from Thomas and earlier theologians, and he's saying, wait, what are we doing in the New World? How you're spreading the faith through massacring all these people? To get gold? Like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. What may be the reason and cause of a just war, he asks. Here, my first proposition is, defense of religion is not a just cause of war. Which is a really important point. So on the one hand, you've had a strong strain of absolute pacifism in Christianity from, your enemy should hit you not 7, but 70 times 7 times before you strike him back, all the way through figures like St. Alban, figures like St. Stephen, people who leave the Roman army and are killed for being unwilling to serve in the Roman army. And then on the other hand, you have stuff like the Crusades. So the First Crusade gets fought really in terms of this just war theory in the cause to go to war. There's a caliph at the time now in Egypt who is destroying all sorts of Christian sites in the Holy Land. Christians are being massacred, and so all these Western nobles come together to go and defend pilgrims, to go and defend Christians who live in the Holy Land. So they have this kind of like reasonable cause of going to war. Later, that gets transmuted into just like, we're making things Christian over there. And so we're very much in violation of this later formulation. Even though they have like a kind of just, in this sense, cause of going to war, the way they conduct the war is never just by Thomas's, Augustine's, Ambrose's standards. You have unarmed Jewish people being burned in their own synagogues. You have the murder of children, the murder of various non-combatants. It's not a just war by any stripe. You get further crusades in which they do things like attack the Byzantine Empire and take Constantinople and take all the gold. Like, just it's all kind of insane. But I think it's worth like remembering that there are Christian voices who say religion never a cause of going to war. Very important. Extensions of empire is not a just cause of war. This is too well known to need a proof. For otherwise, each of the two belligerents might have an equally just cause, and so both would be innocent. So I say, I want to extend my territory into Scotland. Scotland says, I want to extend my territory into England. We fight, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are killed. We destroy all these farms and so forth. Well, nobody's at fault. We both just wanted bigger empires. The Victoria is like, that's crazy. That's not logic at all. This, in its turn, would involve the consequences that it would not be lawful to kill them, and so imply a contradiction, because it would be a just war. There are lots of great pictures of De Victoria on the internet, so you get a range of views on De Victoria. Neither the personal glory of the prince, nor any other advantage to him, is a just cause of war. This too is notorious. For a prince ought to subordinate both peace and war to the common weal of his state, echoing Thomas again, and not to spend public revenues in quest of his own glory or gain, much less expose his subjects to danger on that account. Herein indeed is the difference between a lawful king and a tyrant, that the latter directs his government towards his individual profit and advantage, but a king to the public welfare. As Aristotle says, also the prince derives his authority from the state, therefore he ought to use it for the good of the state. Also laws ought not to be enacted for the private good of any individual, but in the common interest of all the citizens. So, for De Victoria, you can't have the gain of the state, nor can you have the gain of an individual. Everything is defensive or protecting those who are defenseless. There's a single and only just cause for commencing a war, namely a wrong received. The proof of this rests, in the first place, on the authority of St. Augustine. Those wars are described as just wars, etc. above, and it is to the conclusion arrived at by St. Thomas and the opinion of all the doctors. Also, an offensive war is for the purpose of avenging a wrong and of taking measures against an enemy, as said above. But there can be no vengeance where there is no preceding fault and wrong, therefore. Also, as a prince has no greater authority over foreigners than over his own subjects. But he may not draw his sword against his own subjects unless they have done some wrong. So, if you have a cause to be defended, or for Augustine and Thomas and De Victoria, if you are sort of avenging some greater wrong, that can still be a just war. There are later Christian critics who will say, even punishing an evildoer, even a punitive war that's completely right, even brutal reparations which make another country suffer after a war, all of this is still unjust. All of this is still wrong. So kind of further evolutions that happen. Read one more slide and then we'll kind of pause for a moment. Not every kind and degree of wrong can suffice for commencing a war. The proof of this is that not even upon one's own fellow countrymen is it lawful for every offense to exact atrocious punishments, such as death or banishment or confiscation of property. As then, the evils inflicted in war are all of severe and atrocious character, such as slaughter and fire and devastation. It is not lawful for slight wrongs to pursue the authors of the wrongs of the war, seeing that the degree of punishment ought to correspond to the measure of the offense. So, some things that De Victoria might be thinking of: one king insults another king. Slaps him with his glove, says he's a fool, whatever. One people insult another people. One kingdom even does sort of saber rattling and says, you're weak, we're powerful, we would destroy you in a war. Give us one provocation and we'll take you down. All these sort of threats. For De Victoria, these don't justify killing. These don't justify war. I have some more slides, but just kind of pause for a moment. For the experts in the room, for the non-experts in the room, how does this sort of resonate with the way you think about just war? Please.
Sure. You gave me the heads up before the service, actually, so I appreciate that. Okay. Great. So, I think incredibly helpful, and thank you so much for tackling this, in real time, right? It's been quite a week. I guess the only thing I would sort of add is to maybe situate a little bit in terms of, so I'm a scholar of international politics at Georgetown, to situate it in terms of maybe a little bit more, not the theology, but the kind of broader politics of it. And I would say that, I think this conversation needs to start from the notion that we all know that murder is wrong, right? It's in the commandments, right? It's very clear what the ethics are around that. But where things get complicated is that, if we live in a sort of sovereign state, we have a state that, has what Max Weber said, monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, right? If somebody does something bad, guess what? There's a court system. They go through it. The state will sanction that person in the appropriate way. When it comes to sovereign states in the international system, the globe, in global politics, who can do that, right? So when bad things happen, how do you deal with that, right? And so the idea is when really bad things happen, you might have to go to war. You might have to do this ethically horrific thing. You might have to kill people, right? And so then that begs the question of under what conditions is that appropriate? Is that both morally appropriate, which you very nicely began to outline, right? It has to be something that's so bad that it's like you cannot figure out how to solve this problem. You've tried everything. You've tried diplomacy. You've tried absolutely everything, and nothing else works. So okay, let's go to war, right? But I also think pragmatically, right? That you have to kind of think about, all right, we're doing this really crazy thing, going to war. When does that pragmatically make sense? When is that going to actually achieve the interests of our country, right? And interestingly, those two things, both the ethical questions and the kind of policy questions, kind of go hand in hand, right? They kind of push in the same direction. It has to be something that's really bad. You can't figure out what to do otherwise, right? And so I think, the way the slide started off with was war as an oxymoron really gets to that, in the sense that, just war is an oxymoron. There are no just wars, but I would say in the sort of international relations, security, policy world, unfortunately, it's this kind of evil that we have to do, right? Unfortunately, I think, that then kind of empowers this way of thinking about the world that actually moves so far away from these ethical and pragmatic judgments, where it's like, this notion of this sort of Hobbesian dog-eat-dog. People hark back to this guy Thucydides, who wrote a couple thousand years ago, who wrote, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, right? Or, Machiavelli's The Prince. That basically all bets are off. Anything goes. You have to act this way, because that's the way the world is. It's called realism, realpolitik, if you like. And so I think what we've been seeing playing out this week has been this fascinating kind of real-time example of all these conversations of these different tensions. And back to your point about religion should never be a reason for war. Religion is often used as a justification and legitimation for war. And I think that's been so fascinating, the Pope explaining that we've been seeing, right? Of sort of the Pope pushing back from his theological position, but then other people like Hegseth and so on in the US government arguing that there are religious justifications for this war. So this really sort of uneasy tension of the fact that the international system, you don't have a legal, sort of supranational legal adjudicator who can figure out how to deal with bad things when they happen, means you are going to have wars, right? You are going to have to go there. But it also means that there are these incredibly complicated and difficult questions, right? So that's all I'm going to say.
Super helpful, thank you. One of the great Archbishops of Canterbury, William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury during World War II, talked about the value of Christian pacifism. And he said that Christian pacifists were an essential witness in the church, and that their voice was a core part of what Christianity did for civilization. So there was this sense that, like, those who say, I'm going to live the ideal life, even in the midst of these horrific situations, that's huge and really important. And then he also talked about the important Christian witness of all those who are not pacifists, who said, this is horrific, I don't want to be a part of this, but as Kate was saying, in this moment I have to. I have to stand up and fight to defend these people in World War II, to defend my own nation, whatever it is. And so there's kind of this interesting balance within the history of Christian thought around these, in both really lauding and really sort of idolizing these Pacific figures, and also really lauding and idolizing these figures of great courage who are fighting sort of in the name of justice. Please.
I'm afraid I missed the dates on these theologians, but where do the Crusades fit in?
That's a great question. So the Victorian was writing after the Crusades. The Crusades are a pretty long phenomenon that kind of span the Middle Ages. So Thomas is sort of in the midst of that world. Victoria he's really a scholastic scholar, although he's really sort of a medieval thinker, even though he's writing in the Renaissance. Because those lines are really not that clear. So he's very much a Dominican in the Thomistic tradition, so he's still kind of, in a sense, doing medieval theology, but sort of after that medieval period.
Do the Crusades factor into their thinking?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the Crusades for them are just one example of war. So we have, in the 19th century, there was this line of thinking that because of the rise of international commerce and because of intermarriage among European royal families, war was really a thing of the past. And you have a sort of 19th and 20th century idealism about like, oh, this is just this kind of uncivil thing that we've gotten past. The medieval and Renaissance world had none of that. People were in states of war constantly. Like if you go to a medieval or Renaissance town, you're like, oh my gosh, it's so cool. There are all these old castles, there are these cool walls. Those were not put there to be charming. Those were put there because everybody was trying to kill you all the time. And so the Crusades were kind of like one example of a moment when everybody's trying to kill you, but that's also like last Wednesday, it's constant. Please. Another expert, please.
This isn't about arms control, it's about something else. I grew up in a time when the United States was in thrall to the domino theory, and it led to a war and our getting involved in Southeast Asia, a war that lasted for many years, in fact, my generation. I've talked to people who are behind it. I know the theory and so forth. There's some logic to it, but we were not attacked. But we tried to preempt ultimately the attack on our country. How does that fit in square with the war?
So this is like, again, really unfair because I have a world expert on disarmament asking me a political question, so I'm going to say, like, I defer to the experts, but Bob's question is, what about the domino theory? What about the kind of theory that engaged American policy over the course of the 20th century that wars kind of preemptively have to be fought to stop a catastrophic political change?
That's the theory we have now, the war in Iran.
Yes, I shouldn't have used past tense. That's a great question. I mean, again, like we have experts here. Let's ask them, please. A theological expert.
It seems to me that just war theory requires consent among certain political entities or religious groups. I would like you to say a word about where you think just war theory fits into asymmetrical warfare.
So consent and asymmetrical warfare. I mean, I think consent is a really big issue in thinking through why war is inherently unjust. So even if you have consent, let's say you have one country that's the aggressor, one country that's being attacked, everybody in the attacked nation says, this is awful, we're not going to put up with this, we're all taking up arms, we rise up as a people. You're still going to have people who are massacred, slaughtered without their consent. You're going to have, in most cases, conscription in which there are some people who don't say, I want to take up arms. They have to kill and be killed without their consent. So I think one of, except in sort of courtly night against night combat, consent is always one of the core injustices. In asymmetrical war, I think one of the principles that really emerges, even early on in De Victoria's work, and then later as you get into sort of the theology of just war, is proportionality. So if you have one country that says, we have 6 guys with spears, and another country that says, well, we have the neutron bomb, so goodbye Bikini Atoll or whatever, that is inherently unjust, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to add on, this is such an important conversation, sort of, okay, defensive war, we all understand. You're attacked, you have to defend yourself. But what about these sort of more questions that sort of, we have to do an offensive thing for defensive reasons, in a way, right? And I think the idea there is that you have to put the bar really, really high to validate that argument. So even the question of domino theory, I don't know, Bob, if you know this work, there was a huge amount of scholarship that was like, this domino theory thing is a story, but states don't really calculate based on looking at what happened over there on their own, what they're going to do in terms of their foreign policy. Domino theory is a very powerful story about why you need to go to war. Or Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction is a very powerful story about why you need to go to war. And so it's appropriate in those circumstances, I think, to need real vetting, right, of those stories because they're very potent political resources, right? And so, I would just add that.
Yeah. Sally, did you have
As a former Quaker, I'm very interested in the theology of nonviolence, and maybe at some point you could address that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, interestingly, the theology of nonviolence is certainly the dominant strain in thinking about war in the early church and in the first maybe 1,000 years of writing about this. I think kind of the normative perspective is just like, well, I'm a Christian, so I just can't do that. And you can kill me for it, I can be a martyr, but I'm not going to take up arms. And that continues to be sort of normative for clergy and religious, so monks and nuns, priests and bishops. Thomas actually had a chapter on this as well, that they just should not be fighting. There are also famous examples contrary to that. If you ever read the Song of Roland, you have Bishop Odo who's stabbing people with his crosier and so forth. Wah, wah. But I think the Orthodox are kind of interesting because I'm told by an Orthodox friend, who's an Orthodox priest, that in Russia, at least before 20th century battles, like in World War II, the priest would come along and bless all the cannons and all the bombs and all the guns with holy water. And then all the soldiers would return from war, and the priest would go along handing out severe penances to everyone who had engaged in killing. It's kind of interesting tension. It's fascinating. Great question, please.
So we were just talking about a rationale to justify war, and the two examples were weapons of mass destruction and the domino theory, and both of them were not sound. They were not fully vetted. They turned out to be not be true. I mean, shame on us for those mistakes.
Christian's point of view here is that if one is going to war based on poorly vetted information or a kind of mythological story, that really is a cause of shame. Augustine talks about this, as does Thomas. And if you go to war believing that you are doing the just thing, and so if let's say I say, we have to go to war against Canada because maple syrup was actually made of poison and they're giving it to our children, let's attack, then I'm very much at fault of engaging in war in an unjust way. If every piece of information that I have is screaming at me this plot to kill all American children by the Canadians, and we seem to have no choice, there's no other way to defend our children because when we go to negotiate with them, they say, we don't know what you're talking about, clearly all lies, then we just have no choice but to fight. For Augustine, if you actually go to war in good faith, genuinely believing you're making a self-sacrifice for the protection of others, you're still on the right side of things. I think it sort of comes down to those who, if there are those who proffer false intelligence, or if there are those who kind of weave these false narratives, like my Canadian maple syrup story, those are the villains in those cases, from a theological perspective.
I think that's great. I would just add, informed citizenry, right? So the soldiers are doing their job. I think that was a beautiful example of the sort of how you deal with that. The politicians, so Noam Chomsky, another person who's no longer on the right side of history, but who had this idea about manufacturing consent, right? And I think that's the interesting thing. Manufacturing consent, right? That in fact these stories are so potent and powerful, and people who have their own political and other motives use them strategically. And so our role in a democracy, right, as citizens, is to ask those questions and to really kind of try to vet that, right? I think that's the only way that this can actually, that we can thrive as a society, and that's what's fair to those soldiers who are putting their lives on the line.
Please.
The thing that struck me about one of the quotes from Victoria was this issue of taking over land that belongs to other people, so and getting them out of the way. if you look at the American story, a lot of the early people, early Europeans coming to this country, were fleeing religious persecution. They left for religious reasons, but then they decimated the indigenous people. And so they found themselves in a situation of going to war when they got here. And it also raises the whole question of where do people go? Human beings will explore. Human beings will find ways to escape persecution in their own land. It's just, it's so complicated.
Yeah, I agree. If you could hear, Sandy made a really nuanced, complex point about the way in which a lot of those who are involved in the kind of killing of Native people in the United States were themselves victims of persecution. They didn't have land for themselves. They needed someplace to go. Just, yeah, complicated human stories, for sure. I will say those Puritans were actually trying to sterilize the Church of England from Anglicanism, so I mean, I say good riddance, but different opinions.
There are others too.
Please.
Wilfred Owen quoted possibly Horace saying, "Don't yet RMS but Pascal Maury."
Lay it on us.
It's sweet and appropriate to die for your country. And he called it the old lie. And they think Horace would do that.
Yeah, it is sweet and appropriate to die for your country. I mean, I think Wilfred Owen had a very close perspective on what that death looks like, right? I mean, he's very much writing about his own experiences, the experience of his comrades. You know, with whom my heart is laden, for golden friends I had, many a roseleaf maiden, many a lightfoot lad, the lightfoot lads. Anyway, he really saw. I mean, the trenches in World War I, like, I don't think it gets much more brutal than that. Not only because of the scale of the death and the scale of the suffering, but because of the novelty. You know, you have this like new world in which it's not two ranks of guys with guns or swords facing each other. It's just like death raining from the skies all the time. How could anyone deal with that? How could anyone find that sweet? And yet, there are other cases in which you know, people talk about giving of themselves to save others as being a gift, and so I think it's also very complicated and way above my pay grade. Please, last one.
So how do we reconcile the quandary when it's God who orders this, God is smiting, or God who's ordering the smiting, when, like for example, when he instructs Moses to the numbers to go into Midianite territory because they were smitten?
Yeah. Absolutely, I think that's such a great. Absolutely. So Melanie's point, somewhere I have this wonderful quote from De Victoria, in which he kind of goes through like, here's what a just war looks like, here's we don't kill civilians, here are all the good things we do, here's how we sort of prosecute this war, unless God has commanded otherwise. And there are those certain circumstances, you know, like the Philistines, you gotta get rid of them. I think it's important to remember that the Old Testament is not, like, God doesn't have this like deep passion for ancient Near Eastern military history, and he wants all of us to like know the facts of these various conflicts intimately. The Bible is written to give us spiritual knowledge of God. And so for the early church, if you're someone like Origen, and Mark Randall James is actually an Origen scholar, so he can speak about this much better than I can. But if you have someone like Origen, he'll say like, okay, there are these situations in the Old Testament, like the Battle of Jericho, and I've used this before because this is what like whopped me over the head, and I was amazed by it when I was in a sophomore class in college. But in his book on Joshua, he says you have this kind of strange situation in which you have this Israelite army. They're wandering through the wilderness. They're going to cross this river. They're told to go march around the walls of the city. The walls are going to come tumbling down, and they have to go in and slaughter everybody. Man, woman, child, animal, the whole shebang. And why would God command this to happen? It's sort of incomprehensible. Origen's answer is, this is actually a story about Jesus. Like, the important thing about this story is what it tells us about Jesus. The actual kind of war piece is not the important part of the story. And what Origen means by that is the reason it's in the Bible is there's this deeper underlying spiritual meaning. So you have this general named Joshua, which in Hebrew is Yeshua, which we translate as Jesus. You have a general named Jesus crossing this river, the River Jordan, in the exact spot where Jesus is said to have been baptized. They go march around this city, they blow the horn of the gospel, these hard walls around our hearts come tumbling down, Jesus rushes in, destroys all the evil within our heart, reigns over us as our king. So that's not to say that somehow answers the question and dismisses it, but the early church emphasis on the stories of the Old Testament was not primarily like, how do I know when God is actually telling me to go destroy a specific people group? It's more like, how do I know what God is calling me to in life? What's the end of the world like? What's my relationship with Christ like? That's kind of one piece. The other piece is most of those, actually, as far as I can think of, all of those very unjust total annihilation stories in the Old Testament are part of the Gigantomachy. So you have this war of the Israelites against the giants. So you have these giant clans that are named in the Old Testament, and then in these stories you actually see them seeking out these giant clans and destroying them. So the giants for the ancient Israelites were the kind of children of, I think it's Genesis 6, when the sons of God have relations with the daughters of men, and these kind of evil beings are born. It's the wiping out of those evil beings. So Goliath is one of those. So if you want to think about it sort of in terms of the context of its own text, it is humans fighting against evil incarnate, or sort of like evil itself, rather than a depiction of Israelites just having to destroy other human groups. Does that make it all like cut and dry and easy? Not at all. It makes it way more complicated and crazy. But when Israel goes to war against Edom, they don't behave like that. They don't have total annihilation. When Israel goes to war against non-giant clan enemies, there are actually rules that they have to abide by, and they're not the same just war theory that later Christians will develop, but there are rules which make it an ineffectual way to persecute a war in ancient world terms, and much less advantageous to those fighting in the war. It's kind of interesting. Good question. I wish I had a better answer. See you on church. Thank you.